Okay, we are at 11, so I want to keep things on track. I hope you all have been enjoying the conference so far. We're excited to have you in this workshop, Support for Families Following a Death in Custody. My name is Adriana. I work for CMHA Ontario. I'm joined here by my colleague, Denise. She'll give a little wave, and we will be moderating today's workshop. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to note a few housekeeping items. We will be taking questions, or our speaker will be taking questions at the end of her presentation. If you do have them kind of mid-presentation, you want to remember them, feel free to put them in the chat and we will review those at the end. You can unmute during the Q&A to also ask questions and be a part of that discussion, but we just ask that you keep your mics on mute for the duration of Shannon's presentation here. This session is being recorded so that this can be on the conference platform for the next 90 days for other participants who aren't able to join us here live. At the end of the session, there will be a brief evaluation. You'll find that in the conference platform in the schedule where you click to access this workshop. And I'll give you a reminder at the end for that. Lastly, we would like to respectfully ask that all of those attending today's session engage with each other thoughtfully and always consider the impact of your words and interactions with others. As moderators, we will not tolerate abusive or inappropriate behavior and will ensure that anyone who engages in such behavior is removed from today's session. So I would like to pass it over to Shannon Palmer. Shannon works for the Human Rights Unit, Service Management and Oversight Division with the Ministry of the Solicitor General, and she will be speaking today about support for families following a death in custody. Welcome, Shannon.
Welcome. Thank you so much, and thank you to the lovely moderators this morning who are helping us. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here with me this morning. Really happy to be here, especially looking at the slate of other presentations happening in the same time slot. There's some other very good looking presentations happening right now. So very pleased that you have chosen to spend some time with me this morning. I'm coming to you this morning from Robinson Huron Treaty Territory over in Northeast Ontario. As we mentioned, I'm the Family Support Liaison for the Human Rights Unit for the Ontario Provincial Adult Level Corrections. Like to just kind of include that caveat because there are many different types of corrections that occur in the province, whether adult, youth, provincial, and federal. And as many know who work with these systems, they're all very separate and have different processes, and there can be lots of overlap and confusion. So my role specifically is grounded in provincial level adult corrections. I have experience as a social worker, a professor, a therapist, a crisis negotiator, and as a probation and parole officer. But I think it's also important to recognize that we all bring all of ourselves to work each day. So to give you a sense of kind of who I am outside of those roles, I'm also a sister, an auntie, a mom, and I'm a genealogy hobbyist. So there's always been a strong theme for me around family and who I am and in the work that I do. And I think that passion around family is a part of what drew me to the work as the Family Support Liaison. So my experiences with my own family also inform my work. I don't have lived experience myself with incarceration, but I've had my experiences as a supporting family member for family members who have experienced difficulty with mental health, with substance use, and with incarceration. And those experiences with family have shaped my approach to the work that I do and have informed some of what I know about the areas that I work in. And so that's a little bit about me as I'm meeting all of you this morning. My hopes over the next a little bit less than an hour are to increase your awareness of the Family Support Liaison program, to increase your understanding of the complex needs a family might experience following a death in custody, to provide you with some information and some strategies for enhancing work that you might be doing or you might be thinking about doing with families, and especially with grieving families. And my other hope is to learn from you, to learn from your questions and from any thoughts that you share with me during the presentation this morning, or if we are in touch after today's presentation. I also hope to kind of learn from what you can share with me. To talk a little bit about context, talking about death can be difficult. I think oftentimes when we're talking about death, I think there's a focus on normalizing death. That death is a part of life, and that is absolutely true. But I want to be mindful that when we're talking about the work that I do, we're not talking about deaths generally speaking. We're talking about deaths specifically in the context of folks who are in custody, and that can have a very different meaning. Deaths occur everywhere that people occur. Every public place in the world potentially experiences deaths. So in that sense, we know that anytime you're in a public place, that death is a part of life and is part of where the public is. But there is that specific context when we're looking at deaths and corrections that mean there are kind of additional layers. Deaths that occur in custody for families can often be unexpected, traumatic, and complex. And that specific context that I think is important to look at when we're talking about death. So I think, that it seems like in a room of wonderful people and professionals and caring people. So I don't think that there would ever be a concern around being glib or being superficial and not taking the topic of death seriously. But I do want to ground just that this is a particularly complex area, an area that touches a lot of folks in their own experiences with their own families, and that's something that we want to be mindful of. When it comes to Ontario corrections and Ontario provincial adult custody, there are a lot of reasons somebody might be in Ontario provincial custody. And I know that folks, many of you work with the justice system, so you have some knowledge of this, but generally, the majority of folks who are in Ontario adult provincial custody are remanded folks, which is to say that they're pre-trial or they're awaiting trial. There are some other populations of folks who could be in custody as well. So that could be sentenced folks, folks who are on a short-term police lockup, federally sentenced folks who are also remanded into provincial custody. So there are many different populations, but definitely the largest group are folks who are remanded. You may also be aware of some of the trends and some of the news that's happened around deaths in custody in the last few years, and numbers of deaths have always varied year to year, but they did experience a peak in 2021. So that's something that there has been some different research around. The Office of the Chief Coroner of Ontario arranged a death review looking at some of the dynamics and some of the trends that can kind of be inferred from that peak. And so there's been some different focus in the last couple of years on understanding where that peak comes from and how to best address it. When we're thinking about deaths in custody, I think the other piece too is looking at kind of how we define and understand deaths in custody. And there's a piece here that can be a bit confusing because it can affect how people understand numbers and trends and analyze these things. Defining in custody is surprisingly complex. And I think this is something that may sound very simple to folks, that somebody is either in custody or they are not in custody. But actually, there are a number of different ways somebody could be considered in custody without physically being in the building of a jail. So when we think about deaths in custody, that can include different definitions where some data sets look at that as someone who is actually in the physical custody of a building. Others look at it more broadly in terms of folks who are on parole or on probation, folks who are serving intermittent sentences, even on their non-sentence days. There's a lot of complexity that goes into understanding that in custody component. That said, I know that folks will have the opportunity tomorrow morning to hear from the tracking and justice folks who are going to be speaking, I think, more to that generally. So if you are interested in understanding that in custody definition and the complexities there, you're going to have that opportunity. So thinking a bit about experiences of families, because this is kind of the heart of the work that I do, I want to think about what are some of the feelings a person might experience when a loved one is incarcerated? And I'm just kind of pitching that to you folks in the room generally, if anyone wants to share on mic or in the chat. Where is he? I see it in the chat here. So Jennifer mentions anger. Yeah, so I think anger is a feeling folks might experience when they have a loved one incarcerated. Jennifer, can I ask you to give me a bit more about like anger towards whom in that scenario?
Typically in my experience, it's been anger towards the staff, anger towards the system.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think it sounds like that multi-directional anger or anger that I think in lots of areas. You guys are having great answers quickly, so I'm just keeping up with you here. I see. So Amanda mentions lost. Lindsay mentions some families may think their loved one is in a safe environment. Lindsay, I agree with you. That's actually something I'm going to come back to that theme. I see a comment about helpless, having no control over what's happening to a loved one. And I agree. I think that's, I think, got to be one of the most profoundly difficult feelings I can think of, is that feeling of that not having control or not having a way to assist or support or to connect with your loved one at that time, right? I think that's got to be a very scary, very lonely feeling. To feel like you don't have that direct avenue to connect with them or to be supportive. I see Lindsay mentions feelings of guilt. There could potentially be some feelings of guilt as well, right? So you guys have hit some really rich and very intense emotions here. I think like from anger, feeling lost, feeling confused, feeling helpless, feeling guilty. So this is, I think, this is a giant collection of very difficult feelings somebody might experience when their loved one's incarcerated. And all these, I think, come from very valid places. And these are all very, I think, realistic emotions, very human emotions that we could probably relate to if we think about that situation. From the work that I've done in talking with families when folks are incarcerated, I think something I've noticed is that we often hear very simplistic narratives about justice systems, where I think there's often a focus on this like false dichotomy of people think of victims and offenders. And those are the two groups of people that I think people sometimes define. It's this odd setup of just there are victims and there are offenders. There are a lot of things that don't work about that dichotomy, but I think one of the big ones that stands out to me is that it overlooks the existence of families, because families don't necessarily fit that dichotomy in either of those two stations, right, as a victim or as an offender. So the experiences of family members are often overlooked when we think about justice system from this framework. When we think about the lives of folks who are incarcerated, family is often an area that's overlooked. And for many, being a family member of a person in custody can mean grappling with those heavy feelings that you guys identified. So feelings like stigma, isolation, and that powerlessness. And families might feel unsure about how to navigate processes and systems related to police, courts, into custody. I think like none of us are born knowing the organizational chart to understand who works in a jail, who do we contact in a jail for which question or for which thing. None of us, I think, intrinsically just know how police and courts operate. So I think it's a very realistic situation to assume that folks aren't sure how to navigate or not sure how to best connect with their loved one who is in those systems. If I pitch you another question, folks, what are some factors that can make grief more complex? What kinds of situations or what kinds of losses do you think make grief more complex for folks experiencing it? I see Lindsay's mentioned here, waiting years for a coroner's inquest and the truth of what happened. Absolutely. And that's something, again, we're going to talk a bit more about. So that wait, like having a long wait. Yeah. You never have to apologize for being very clever, Lindsay, and you are, because I see that you are. Yeah, I think we have some similar thoughts here. Yeah, so I think having a long wait for resolution, for a next step, for an understanding of what's happened, I think having that delay absolutely could make grief more complex. What other dynamics make for complex grief? Let me tell you about the ones that I thought about. So in thinking about complex grief, to me, one of the first things that comes to mind is like a loss that is unexpected. So and this is goes to part of Lindsay's point from earlier, is that I think I've noticed with families that there's a dynamic where when someone in a family has lived with, say, with challenges around mental health or challenges around substance use, families may have become accustomed to having some degree of worry about that person, that person is on their mind. They worry about that person's wellness and their safety. Sometimes it's some of the time, sometimes it's a lot of the time, sometimes it's all the time. But sometimes that worry for that person and their wellness can be part of their life that they're used to. And so families, I think, sometimes are used to that feeling of worrying that their loved one could be injured, could be harmed, could die prematurely. And then what I hear from lots of families is that often for them, when their loved one is incarcerated, that's the moment where they breathe that sigh of relief. that families feel like they can let their guard down and they don't need to worry because they know that their person is cared for, that their person, they know where they are, they know that they are warm, that they are fed, that they have access to healthcare, and that there are people looking out to protect them. So they don't need to worry about exploitation or harm, and that they can kind of rest or get that moment of relief and feel like their family member is in a safe place. And so a loss that happens when someone is in custody is that much more unexpected because it happens at a time where family members might have let their guard down, or they might have felt like they didn't need to worry about their loved one. So that very unexpected loss, I hear from lots of families that is part of what I think what is so cruel about their loss or so difficult about their loss initially is having that news that that their loved one has passed away at that moment where they felt or they hoped that they were safe. So knowing that that unexpected nature can be very difficult for families. The second theme I thought about, with similar to Lindsay, was that idea of like a lack of information. So being without information, I think, is an area where I think people should hopefully have a lot of compassion. That I think human beings, like, we're meaning-making creatures. Our brain work every day to make meaning out of our experiences. We want to have an understanding of what has happened. I think anytime any one of us hears that someone in our life has passed away, or even I think someone distant in our life, when a celebrity passes away, I think one of the first immediate questions people have is like, what happened? And that's a very reasonable question, I think. I think people want to have an understanding and make sense of what has happened. So I think that the desire to have information or have understanding what's happened is very, very fair and very reasonable. But it's also complicated by a lot of the processes and investigations that happen when someone passes away. And I'm going to tell you a bit about that later. But the challenge I find for folks is that lack of information, especially early on, it can be very, very difficult and really kind of increase the complexity of someone's grief. The next dynamic I thought about was the feeling that grief is invisible or invalidated. So someone's grief might be around a loss that is stigmatized in some way. Uh, People in their life might not have had an understanding that their loved one was incarcerated. They might not have understood difficulties that their loved one was living with. And so they may have low social support for their loss. They might not feel supported by others in grieving their lost loved one. If I think if society generally has placed a low value on that loved one, or if that was a stigmatized loved one, I think that can make it more difficult for families to feel seen and supported in their grief. Which connects to that idea that of typical avenues of grieving not feeling available. So people might feel like, due to like the unique nature of their loss, they don't fit into mainstream bereavement services. They might feel like those that they don't fit in with other people and the nature of other people's losses. So they might have a harder time turning to mainstream services that are available. Another challenge can be not having control over privacy while grieving. This is such a challenge I find in like impact of like modern media and online news media and things, is that families experiencing grief are often at risk of whatever online comments or online coverage they see about their loved ones passing. So I think there's that mixed effect of media involvement where for some families they find it feels very helpful to increase awareness or to connect with other sources of support, but balanced always with I think just about every family I've ever spoken with has shared that there's been some element of unkind media coverage or unkind online commenting, or even like that folks will seek out family members online to make unkind comments to about the nature of their loved one or about their loved one's passing, which is something I think so difficult to fathom, that there could be people who would take the time out of their day to go out of their way to be hurtful to someone grieving. It still astounds me, but I know that unfortunately is something that people experience, is that when their loss is public, that sometimes opens them up to very unkind people. And then finally, one of the factors that increases complexity of grief can just be having a complex relationship with the person who you've lost, where relationships may have been damaged or there may have been some distance. Folks, I think, are sometimes not just grieving the person that they've lost, but they're also grieving like their hopes for the future, their hopes that that person would be able to reconnect, or that they would have a period where they could have a greater connection in the future, a greater role in their lives. And so folks when someone passes away in difficult times or difficult times in that relationship, I think there's a lot that is lost in terms of those future hopes and dreams for that person and for that connection. And so I think that just leads to, I think it's a big, big grief for people, that there's incredible complexity to the losses people experience. And that reflects in the grief they experience, and it reflects in how they grieve and how that grief impacts them. So to tell you a bit about kind of my program and where the FSL program comes in, the FSL program to me still feels like it's very new, but I think we are past the year mark. So the program was launched in the spring of 2022, and it actually launched at a time that was very helpful because it launched around the same time of the Office of the Chief Coroner's death review that I mentioned earlier about looking at the peaks and the dynamics that we can find in deaths in custody. And so through collaboration with the death review, I was able to do consultation with family members who had experienced the death of a loved one in custody in the past few years. And so based on those conversations with families and families who had recent losses and families who had losses kind of a number of years ago, it was very helpful to kind of hear about their needs, both in the immediate and in the longer term, and about how they've been affected and what might have helped them. So that consultation with families is really where the FSL program and services were built from, is that their experiences helped shape what we provide today. There's an understanding the program is kind of influenced by trauma-informed theory and understanding that, well, a loss in custody is a traumatic loss for families, and that whatever opportunities there are to minimize like additional trauma, we want to be taking those. And the program draws upon internal and community resources to help support the needs of affected families. So you may know, like Ontario Provincial Corrections has institutions across the province, as far north of west as Fort Francis, all the way to Windsor, Ontario. So there's a large geographic area that families may be in, and families are not necessarily all in Ontario or all in Canada. Sometimes someone's closest family members may be in another country. And so working with different community resources in each family's community when they need support has been very helpful in helping folks kind of have the most ease of access to services. So I want to tell you a little bit about the processes that unfold when a death occurs in custody, just so you can have an understanding of some of the experiences that families have navigating. So when a death occurs in custody, kind of that first step for families is notification. It's about completing a notification and letting someone know that their loved one has passed away. So when a death occurs in custody, the local police service is notified, and the institution and the police kind of collaborate to determine contact information for the next of kin, or for like the closest possible family member or connection. Ideally, this information kind of is easily accessible. It could be that every person who enters provincial correctional institution is asked to provide emergency contacts. We do know, however, sometimes folks don't have an emergency contact to provide. Sometimes contact information has changed. Numbers might be out of service. There can be challenges with information not being up to date. And so sometimes the police need to do some looking with their resources to try to determine contact information for a next of kin. Ideally, this process is as quick as possible, but depending on the complexity, if there's, say, someone's next of kin is in a different country and it takes time to find them and obtain contact information and have their local police in that country go and notify them, it can be a longer process. But ideally, next of kin notification can be kind of minutes to hours to days, depending on the complexity of how difficult it is to find it, and to locate and contact a next of kin. When it comes to death notification and looking at best practices around notification, I think the 4 elements that have stood out to me are that death notification needs to be timely, it needs to be as soon as possible. It needs to be private and handled with some level of discretion. I think it's not news you would want to give somebody while they were in a public place, that kind of thing. Death notification should be done wherever possible in person. I think death notification over the phone, I think does not always feel supportive or compassionate. It also doesn't allow the person doing the notification to have a sense of the risks that might be present. So someone might have a very significant emotional response or a medical response to death notification. And so I think there needs to be someone present in the room to know if that person needs additional supports or emergency supports. So I think death notification is best done in person, and it's best done in a compassionate way by somebody who has some degree of training or expertise on death notification. And I think also with understanding the options for ideally the cultural or spiritual supports included where they're reasonably known that they would be welcomed by the person. So I think that to me is that timely, private, in-person, and compassionate notification to me is kind of the cornerstones of death notification best practice. The way that I think of it is that there is no good way to give really, really bad news, but there are a lot of ways to do it worse. So I think it's really ultimately you're giving somebody some absolutely terrible news. But I think there are a lot of ways that can be done more appropriately. So the next of kin notification is completed in person by police. The reason that's done by police as opposed to the institution staff itself, or that because of that wide geographic spread that I mentioned around sometimes someone's next of kin is in a different city, a different province, a different country. And because of the necessity that it be done in person wherever possible, institutional staff don't have that type of reach or that ability to leave the institution to travel to the community where someone's next of kin might be to do that in person. And so that's why police are relied upon to do the notification. The immediate notification that occurs is done to the next of kin. And that's done because I think that element of privacy gives the opportunity for the next of kin to have some power over how and when and with whom they share that information. So knowing that later there are processes through which identifying and non-identifying information can both become available publicly. So I think there will ultimately be information that's known on a kind of more publicly about the death, but the initial notification is private to the next of kin so that they have that level of power over their privacy in that moment. So folks sometimes find this a bit confusing if they're familiar with federal system notification. So we know for Correctional Service Canada, they do a slightly different process. They do a news release when someone passes away in federal custody. I think part of the rationale around their difference is that everyone in their custody has been found guilty. And so it's kind of considered public knowledge that that person was in custody, whereas in provincial level, I mentioned like the majority of folks are still remanded and have not been found guilty. And I think like from what I hear from families is that like, the majority of families would not want something public initially because they lose that power over their privacy. So I think letting families share that information at the pace that they're comfortable with and with the people they're comfortable with feels like a good approach in the beginning with notification. Though the ministry does post like non-identifying statistics annually. So I think the number of folks who have passed away in custody in a given year will be known, but not necessarily like the individual's names for each death. So I think, and we'll talk a bit more about inquests and other ways that information can become public, but I think generally there's an understanding that information will be public in some form at some point for many deaths. But at that initial notification stage, it's private to the family receiving the news. So when a death occurs for a person in custody, there's 3 investigations that take place for all deaths in custody. So the first is the coroner's death investigation. So the coroner is notified when a death takes place, and their investigation begins kind of in that moment. And their role is to understand the cause of death. So what physically has occurred that caused this person's death. The second is the police investigation. So the local police service is notified for each death, and their role is to investigate, as most of us would reasonably guess, like if the death was criminal in nature. And that's their role. The third investigation is Correctional Services Oversight and Investigation, or CSOI. The CSOI unit, their investigation's purpose is to understand whether staff or of the correctional facility followed policies and procedures before and after the person's death. So there's these three investigations that are taking place kind of at the same time with these three different agencies. And they're, as you see, like they have different purposes in the heart of their investigation, but each kind of contributes information that can be helpful. Each of these investigations have information that can be requested by families and by next of kin or families who are wanting to have a greater understanding. That said, because these are three separate investigations, there are kind of three different processes to request information from each one. So a family looking for information about their loved one's death, they may request the coroner's report and have that information from that investigation. They may also choose to look to these other sources of information to have a greater understanding of what's happened. So there are these three investigations with their three different processes that all have information that a family might be interested in. But I think many folks, especially folks who are dealing with difficult grief, I think it's understandable why they might not be able to navigate or understand these three different investigations and their processes and the methods to obtain information from each process at a time when they're kind of consumed with grief. So this is part of the role of the FSL, is to help families understand the different investigations and the processes and how they can obtain information from them. So the next element, I don't consider it an investigation on its own because it kind of flows from the coroner's investigation, but the next possibility is a coroner's inquest. And folks may have some familiarity with coroner's inquest over the years. A coroner's inquest is a public hearing, and it reviews the circumstances around a death to make recommendations to help prevent like a similar death in the future. Recommendations are made by a jury of 5 people from the community where a death occurred, and so it's from the community, 5 kind of everyday people. There's no no greater selection or criteria for folks. There's no educational requirements, experience requirements, things like that. I think sometimes folks have the understanding that it's like a panel of experts that make those recommendations. In fact, a coroner's inquest is 5 everyday people who have ideally like 5 completely different perspectives and different experiences and different frameworks of understanding, different lenses that they can view things through. So you have 5 people offering different experiences, different wisdom, different knowledge sets to making these recommendations. A coroner's inquest is mandatory for any custody death that's a result of non-natural causes. So when the coroner's investigation looks at cause of death, if a coroner finds that the cause of death is non-natural cause, there will automatically be a coroner's inquest. Where a custody death is a result of natural causes, it's up to the coroner's discretion whether to call an inquest. And in kind of exercising that discretion around whether or not to call an inquest, one of the things a coroner is to consider is any requests made by family. So family can also have the opportunity to give input as to whether they think an inquest is recommended in this situation, or if they would like to have an inquest into their loved one's death. So the family's wishes are a factor that the coroner is to consider in making that decision. But it leaves natural cause deaths up to that discretion of the coroner. And looking a little bit about the history of that, back in 2009 that the legislation changed, not requiring a coroner's inquest as mandatory for natural cause deaths. And they were looking at the time like the tremendous kind of backlogs and workloads related to inquests, and they found that they were conducting inquests that led to no recommendations. So I think in around 2008, I think there were more than 20 inquests that resulted in no recommendations for natural cause deaths, because essentially the juries were not finding any recommendations to make where someone's death was as a result of natural causes, and they couldn't see kind of an opportunity for recommendations in those. So looking at those experiences of inquests that didn't lead to recommendations led to the change in legislation, and looking at leaving it to a coroner's discretion with the wishes of the family being considered about whether a natural cause death will have a coroner's inquest. And that said, whether an inquest is mandatory or discretionary, feelings about inquests for families from every family I've spoken with are quite complex. Some families very much look forward to the inquest process as a way to have kind of a full understanding of what happened to their loved one, to have the opportunity to hear from witnesses and to see evidence presented, and to have that level of understanding and explanation of what's happened. And so some families are very welcoming of that and wanting to be part of that experience. For other families, I hear their feedback that they, I think, find the loss of privacy to be very difficult. So to have news articles that name their loved one, and news articles that share details about their death and their life, families can find that very difficult. Families may welcome that opportunity for recommendations to be made that can help prevent other deaths in the future. I think very often that's something I hear about, is the hopes about systems and processes being improved so that other deaths will be prevented in the future. At the same time, knowing that it can be tremendously difficult to participate in an inquest and to hear kind of intimate details about your loved one's life and their death in a public forum is, I think, a fairly unnatural thing that many of us don't experience in life. And so I know that that can be very difficult for families to face when they're going through grief and their grieving processes. I think an inquest is something that most of us don't have as part of our grief when we lose a loved one. Many of us will go our whole lives without ever experiencing one. And so I think it's something that is kind of adds that extra element of like an unnatural process to death. So all of these, the three investigations I mentioned and an inquest, it's like each of those adds a layer of complexity and difference to custody related deaths that can be very difficult for families, that their natural grieving processes and rhythms are interrupted by these periods where they may spend years kind of looking forward to and also dreading the opportunity for an inquest. And then I think by the time inquests occur, sometimes families feel like they're in a very good place with their grief, and that they're feeling like they are at a place where their grief is kind of bearable on a day-to-day basis. And then they reach the point of the inquest and they find that may reopen those feelings from their early grief. And so I think our inquests are so complex in how that they affect families and families' experiences of them. And so I think Lindsay, you mentioned earlier, like the wait for an inquest itself, I think is part of that complexity. There's often a wait of, I think it's really changing in the years since COVID. I think it's getting quicker, and I'm seeing inquests happening more frequently. And I think that there was a significant pause in the backlog during COVID where inquests were not taking place, which resulted in kind of additional years delay. When we look back at inquests, coroner inquests have been happening since the late 1800s. If someone passed away in the 1900s and had a coroner's inquest, it was often the same day, if not the next day. I don't know that that's ideal either. That seems very quick to me, but I think the difference between having an inquest the next day and having an inquest 5 years later, both are not ideal in my mind. So I think in hearing from families about their grief and their processes and kind of what the best timing would be, families often find that they would have wanted the inquest to be sooner. And so that is something that I think seems to be becoming more and more possible as inquests are moving forward. But it's something that I think looms large for many families in their grief, is that their grief is kind of always on pause, awaiting an inquest, and then awaiting like the resolution of the inquest or any new information or understandings the inquest might bring. So it's a very long time for families to wait and to be kind of in that stuck, suspended state of kind of early grief of waiting for inquest. In looking at the role for me, like as the FSL, kind of ways that I try to support or to assist families during those waits. My role starts when a death takes place. I do outreach to family members as soon as possible after notification has been done for the family. So again, I don't do the notification itself, because that's done in person by police, but I do outreach to the family shortly thereafter. And so I try to make contact with family and understanding, of course, that like the early days of grief are a blur for most people. There's lots of shock and lots of confusion. And so I try to do an initial outreach, and then try to, if I'm not successful or don't connect with the family, I will try to do another outreach a day or two later and try to kind of check in to assess whether somebody doesn't wish to talk to me or if somebody just is not ready to talk. But generally for most families, I have a connection within 1 or 2 days after the death notification. At that point, I try to become their point of contact for questions that they have for the institution, respecting that families can have all manners of complex feelings about institutions. It can sometimes feel more comfortable for them to have one centralized point of contact rather than reaching out to multiple folks at institution. So I take on that role of kind of coordinating any questions they have for the institution. At that first contact with families, I provide information on contacting the coroner if they've not already had contact from the coroner already, and navigating next steps around cremation, burial, funeral, or any of those options, including financial assistance options for those things. I work with the institution and the family to arrange for the deceased person's property to be released to the next of kin. And we try to make sure that it's released as quickly as possible, knowing that there's some complexities around release of property, such as police or coroner. Police and coroner have to approve the release of property, that it's not needed to be held as evidence or for any part of their investigation. So there can be a delay in releasing property, but the hope is always to release it as quickly as possible because I think that's the compassionate thing to do. I work with families on, I provide information on those 3 investigations that take place, understanding a bit about inquests, understanding a bit about the processes to request information from the investigations. And then I check in with families kind of at key intervals. So a lot of my check-ins with family are kind of driven by what's going on in their situation. If they are wanting more support or if they have questions or if they're wanting to connect more, we connect more. Some families prefer to kind of take the information and then they'll reach out to me if they would like to talk further. But then for all families, I try to do a check-in around the time, like around the 6-month mark, to check in to see if they understand the process to request the coroner's report. I may check in with them around the time the coroner's report is released to see if they have questions or concerns or if there are any support concerns for them. And then checking in just around their kind of as their grief unfolds and then kind of on that grieving journey about if there are points where they might not have thought that they needed or they would benefit from referrals to bereavement supports early on. A few months later in their grief, they might feel like they are realizing that they would like to connect with some other bereavement support. So we can explore options for them in that way. But they're kind of checking in with them kind of at those key events or around specific needs that arise. So my amount of contact with each family can be very different, kind of driven by that family's needs or that family's preferences. I'm going to tell you a little bit from the rest of our time just about kind of some of my takeaways from building the FSL program and the things that I think might be interesting for other folks who are either doing work with grieving families or thinking about doing that work. Something that was important to me was that our program have a very broad definition of family. So knowing that family can mean a lot of things to different people. Like the meaning of family can vary across cultures and experiences. Some folks kind of have a biological family, some folks have chosen family. And respecting that incarcerated people may have experienced individual or systemic disruptions to their family unit. So I think of things like experiences like residential school, like 60s and millennial scoops, experiences of foster care, experiences of adoption. There are a lot of these systemic disruptions to a family unit that someone may have had no control over. And so their family unit and what it looks like today may have been affected by those things. So with this in mind, and trying to understand the best way to kind of define family, we look to the definition that's kind of been used over the years by the United Nations and by Correctional Service Canada, which is we define a family as a group of individuals who are related by affections, kinship, or trust. So looking at family kind of through that broad lens, because somebody's family member who kind of felt closest to them in life might not be somebody who is in like what we would think of as their immediate core family. It could be, I think of like an auntie, a cousin, a foster sibling. So I think having that broad definition of family means that we're able to kind of support the people who are most affected by a death, even if they weren't necessarily the immediate next of kin. Also important to me is the idea that when working with grieving people, that we accept people where they are and respecting that people have the right to anger and that people who are experiencing grief, shock, and trauma might communicate those things in ways that can be difficult to receive. But I think it's important to be mindful of tone policing, and I think it's not reasonable to have an expectation that people grieving and in the worst period of their lives are always polite or always considerate of whatever my needs might be. I think that I am blessed in that I don't know the things that I might say or do or how I might treat somebody on the worst day of my life. I'm fortunate that I don't know that. So although we might assume we would behave one way, I think grief is incredibly disruptive and affects people differently. So I want to accept that however someone is feeling in their grief, that's what's fair for them in that moment. I think working with families too, it's important to accept that people may not trust you and that they have likely reached that conclusion based on very valid experiences. So I think I don't expect that anyone necessarily trust me or have that confidence that I'm a good person who's there to support them. I think folks who interact with systems are often learn wisely to be wary of systems and things like that. So I know that can be a concern, and I want to be respectful of that. I want to consider like the dignity and humanity of the people that I serve and their families. So I think sometimes I hear narratives around people in custody about like the idea of like they're just like us, or like families who are grieving are just like our families. And I understand that in spirit, and I do think that can be true, but I also think like the degree to which someone is similar to me or is dissimilar to me, that's not the basis upon which we determine which human rights they're entitled to or how their family should be treated. So I think whether or not someone is like me or similar to my own family is not important when it comes to what they deserve and what their rights are when they're grieving. So I think being accepting of people and their situations and being conscious of language beliefs that perpetuate stigma, I think it's a very difficult time for families who may be hearing a lot of negative messaging about the person who's passed away and the circumstances of their loss. And I think really just being sure that we're accepting people and their situations and we're not doing anything to make that period in their lives more difficult. In a similar vein, I think recognizing the diversity of families. So I think knowing that like every person who passes away in custody had their own unique gifts, talents, and meaning to their families and to their communities. And so every person's family is going to have unique needs and preferences. Folks might be familiar with the author, Shannon Palmer, and she talks about like the danger of knowing a single story, and that we never want to assume that because we know one person's story, we know everyone's story. So every family's preferences and experience around grief and loss are very different. And so I don't ever want to make assumptions about what one family's wishes or preferences might be based on my experience with other families. It's important to me to kind of hear from each family about what their needs are. It's important, I think, to practice honesty and transparency in the work that we do. So earlier I mentioned to you that I come from Robinson-Huron Treaty area today, and folks might know a bit about the history of the Robinson-Huron Treaty, but way back at the signing of the treaty, Doquis Community Chief Michael McKeesey Doquis, when he was signing the treaty with Robinson, the government agent, he expressed some hesitation about signing the treaty and how it could affect his community. And what Robinson had said to him was that he need not to be afraid to give up his rights because the government would never do anything to harm his community. And I think about that because I think we can all kind of reasonably infer like that's not necessarily what happened, or like that's not been the truth of what's happened since the signing of that treaty. So thinking about that moment and that reassurance that people don't need to be afraid because the crown would not harm their people. I think to me, it reminds me of the special responsibility that I have as a government worker in practicing honesty in the work that I do and being honest with people and having a willingness to listen to them or to try to understand harms that they've experienced. So I think considering that people you support may have had experiences where others have been dishonest with them and that's been harmful, I think it's much better to be transparent when I don't know or can't provide information than to try to obscure that. Oh, I see something in the chat here. So I see Lindsay mentions an example of how stigma continues with federal systems. So federal corrections, CSC gives a news release of the person who died, and they list all the charges and why they were incarcerated. And Lindsay says this isn't really necessary, and it allows people to pass judgment and have biases, and the person deserves to die due to their charges. Yeah, and I think for families, that's so hard to hear your loved one who you had, like, I think of like hopes, dreams, love for you're that person. Like to hear them summarized in that way has got to be so hard. I think like I hope to live like as many more years as possible. I feel like 60 is probably doable. Like if I live 60 more years, I'm fairly sure whoever writes my obituary when that happens, I want to think they won't summarize me with like a couple sentences listing the worst things I ever did, the worst moments of my life, the worst situations I've ever been in. Like I really assume that somebody's going to summarize me in a like a more loving and caring way. Knowing that at that point I will have passed away and I won't be reading it. I won't be offended or hurt by it. But who the obituary I think is for the surviving people and the surviving family, and that I think is who is hurt by that too. When you experience a loss and you see it summarized in the news in that light. So like Lindsay mentioned, I think that, I've got to imagine that's got to be so hard for families to see that. And my final takeaway is just it's been important to me to listen to the teachings that grieving people have wanted to share with me. And so the work that I've done, I came to my position at a really interesting time because I had the opportunity to take on the family support program at a time where I had welcomed a child. So for me, it's like the connection for me with FSL is very linked to my connection with parenting and with family. And so I really listen to what folks tell me when they talk about their experiences of loss. And so I think my takeaways have been that I value the time that I have with my loved ones. I'm mindful that that's a privilege that I have that other people have not gotten to have. I take pictures of my family. And so this is something that a mom shared with me who lost her son, and she knows that I share it with other people. But she shared that in the last year of her son's life, she had gone through some changes with her body where she was feeling very self-conscious about her appearance. So she didn't take pictures of herself often, or she would never be in family photos. She would just take the photos. And she shared that when she was looking back at pictures with her son, she doesn't have any pictures of them together in the last few years of his life because she felt self-conscious about her appearance. And she shared with me how she regretted that. So I think I can honor that part of her loss by making sure that I listen to that. And I take pictures with my family. I take pictures of my family constantly. And so that's, I think, something that she appreciates that I share with others is that spend that time with your family, take pictures, and make sure you value that time. Something else I've learned a lot about is end of life planning. I had always kind of had the understanding that wills and estates were things that folks had when they were much older or very wealthy. And because I am neither, I didn't think that that applied to me or that I needed one. And I have learned so much about the importance of having a will and end of life planning. So I now encourage everyone I encounter to think about end of life planning and think about having a will. And think that there are many different community resources and different communities that can assist with that. And then finally, like I pay attention to my wellness and the times when I need support. And I think sometimes when people hear a bit about the work that I do, I think they get a bit concerned about me and that the work must be hard for me. And that always makes me a bit uncomfortable because I think like I don't think of myself as the center of the work that I do. I think of families are the center of the work that I do. So I think it's kind that people think about that. So I think to give some reassurance, I think I do think about my wellness and I think about my support needs and my ability to do this work. I think it's important to me to have a realistic perception of my work and to have a sense of the impact of my work and my effectiveness as a helper. So those are things that I try to listen to and to pay attention to so that I can be as healthy as possible to be able to do helping work as long as possible. And on that note, I know that we have a few minutes left and folks may have questions or thoughts. And I know also, I think maybe you folks, maybe our moderators are going to remind about the evaluation because I remember that's something we talked about before the end. But in our few minutes together, are there folks who have thoughts or questions? Oh, I just see. Oh, Lindsay, you are so kind. I'm doing this here. Thank you. Lindsay, is it okay if I'm going to ask out loud, so I hope it's okay if I mention that you are presenting tomorrow morning?
Yeah, of course.
Awesome.
it's not going to be maybe as there might be a little bit more numbers, just more research, but I just really appreciate the honesty that you came with this. For me personally, as someone with lived experience too, sometimes ministry presentations can also be extremely triggering. And so I just applaud you for kind of not following the lip service or the language that the ministry in general uses. And so just thank you for being compassionate in this presentation, sincerely.
Yeah. Thank you, Lindsay. That means a lot. Thank you. I will be in the virtual front row tomorrow to see you present. I'm like, there's no front row when we're all online, but I like to think I would be in the front row because I'm looking forward to hearing more about your research. So I do have my contact information on the screen there for folks who I think there's so much information that folks must be taking in today and tomorrow. I know I'm so excited about the different workshops happening. So I think it may be that other things are going to be more present on your mind right now while you're immersed in the conference. But I do encourage folks to, you can always look back to my contact information and we can always connect and talk more if you have ideas, if you have suggestions, if there are things that you want to connect around. I do encourage folks to reach out. I'll take my slides off the screen here for now, but are there any other questions or thoughts folks wanted to share with me?
Yeah, one question in the chat from Amanda about do you have any information sheets that can be provided to families outlining how to request information for in-custody death investigations?
Thank you, Amanda. Great question, because I am also someone who loves like a tangible resource that I can share with folks. So there's like a good news, bad news here. So the bad news is I don't have anything available today, but the good news around that is that's because there's things that are in development. So I have in development, it's a family support liaison guidebook for families for when a death occurs in custody. And it was really influenced by that period of consultation with families about what information they needed and what would be most helpful. So I want to say, like, I'm biased in that I wrote it, but I find like it is fairly comprehensive in terms of different pieces of information families might need or want, or might not even realize that they need or want at the time. That said, because it's kind of a meaty document, there are some steps it goes through in terms of like it has to go through approvals and in terms of like a translation so that it's available in French language as well. So it's not rolled out yet because we're not finished with translation and with like the like construction of the document yet. But once it's available, it will be available online through the ontario.ca website, and then it'll also be available like through me. So that's something that I will extend to families when I first have contact, but then also that I'm hoping community agencies and folks can be knowledgeable about, so that they can recommend it to families or pass it on to families or share the link with families that it might benefit. So unfortunately for Amanda, I don't yet today, but I do hope that it will be available in like the digital form or in paper form in the coming months. Oh,
Wonderful.
and Amanda, with a doubling down on a great idea, I agree. That will be great for Justice Program to have, and it's available. Agreed. I will. I'm going to make a note that there's different justice programs in the different offices. Great idea. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon, for your presentation. I learned a lot as somebody who isn't directly involved with justice work. Thank you. It was very insightful, and really appreciate your messages and your learnings from the work that you're doing. For our participants, thank you for being in this workshop. We would love for you to fill out the evaluation. If you have a couple minutes now, you can find that link in the conference schedule platform. And we have about a 60-minute lunch break right now till 1 o'clock. And that's when our keynote is presenting, highlighting crisis response services and models across Ontario. So hope to see everyone back in the plenary session for that. And thank you for joining us in this workshop.
Thank you so much, folks. And thank you, moderators.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.